Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and this week we're going to talk about mixtures. The reason why we're going to talk about mixtures, or really mix-ups, kind of, is because the eighth perek of Zevachim, also known as perek Ta'aruvot, the chapter of mixtures, talks all about, in all of its mishnayot, talks all about what happens if an item of one status gets mixed in with an item of another status. But many of us are familiar with the halachot of ta'arovet, of mixtures from the kitchen, right? Milk and meat that get mixed by accident, maybe even kosher, non-kosher that get mixed by accident. And what I think stands out about the beginning of the eighth parak of Zevachim is, as opposed to what we're used to when we talk about milk and meat mixtures, where we say, oh, batal b'shishim, it'll be nullified if it's 60-to-1 ratio. We actually start the Mishnah in the eighth parak of Zevachim saying, here's an example where there is no possibility of bittul. There's no possibility of nullification. It doesn't matter the ratio of the mixture. There's nothing you can do about it. And when you have a situation like that, you sort of have to take a step back and say to yourself, oh, well, maybe there is something else to the conversation about mixtures than what I already know, right? So what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time in the rabbinic conversation, specifically the Tannaitic conversation, meaning I'm looking Mishnah and Tosefta. I'm not going to Gemara right now. Specifically Mishnah and Tosefta, the rabbinic conversation about times where bittul is not possible. And it seems like the reason why bittul is not possible, why nullification is not possible, is because the item itself just isn't, I would say it's like unassimilable. Like you can't assimilate it into something else. It remains, it stands on its own. Now, I want to make clear that the examples that we're going to look at are examples of what we call yavesh b'yavesh, where you have a solid that's mixed in with other solids. So it's easier to understand a solid not being assimilable, I think, than a liquid not being assimilable, right? Or a solid with another solid not being assimilable. But I want us to see in Tannaitic literature that phenomenon. And I also want us to see when there is an exception to that phenomenon, because that's going to be instructive as well. I want to put the whole conversation about mixtures, which shows up in so many places in rabbinic literature. The whole conversation, I want to put it into a broader lens. So one lens that I want to put it in is just the idea of Chazal as the rabbis as scholastics. Just the idea as the rabbis as bringing clever test cases, not because this is what happens, not because this is what happened, but because in some way it helps you understand the law in a deeper sense, right? Test cases help you understand the law. And so we come up with clever cases that are not necessarily meant to reflect reality. And it helps us build out what the legal system means, what its parameters are, and allows us to clarify. But there's a different kind of conversation that I want to put this in as well, which is I think that mixtures, the discussion about what happens if this falls into that or that gets mixed with that, is also part of just a general rabbinic discussion about uncertainty. And in general, the rabbis express deep um, acceptance of the notion of suffix, the notion of doubt, right? Meaning it is true that it took a very long time until I think the 18th century until we had a compendium of doubt that shows up, at least in financial law, called contras sfeikot. But the idea is that there's suffix, there's uncertainty at every corner. There could be uncertainty about, did I remember to, did I actually bench? Did I do Birkat Hamazon or did I not? There could be uncertainty about, is this piece of meat that I found here kosher? If six of the restaurants here are kosher and four are not, there can be all sorts of uncertainty, including mixtures. These things got mixed up. I'm not sure which is the problematic one and which is the legitimate one. So what do I do? And Moshe Halbertal, in his introduction to The Birth of Doubt, his book about Safek within rabbinic literature, talks about the fact that it's pretty remarkable that the rabbis build out this whole edifice thinking about doubt. And it's a very non-fundamentalist kind of position. It's a very non-absolutist position. And I really appreciate that because I think it's something we take for granted, but the human fallibility and human error that they anticipate happening is a very non-fundamentalist approach to say, okay, we can deal with this. And that's why the examples where bittul doesn't work, where there's no possibility of nullification, really stand out to me because usually it's like, okay, we'll figure this out. But there's some cases where, no, we're not going to figure it out. So let's take a look at what happens in Sifrut Tanait, rabbinic literature from the Tanaitic period about this issue. Because it itself, it's sort of a world unto itself. Forget what you know about Bittul B'Shishim, 60 versus 1 ratio. Forget what you know about Bittul B'Rov, majority overwhelming the minority. Forget it. We're in a different realm here. So the opening Mishnah in the 8th perek of Zevachim goes as follows. Kol hazvachim shenit'arvu b'chataot hamitot o b'shor haniskal. If you have sacrificial animals, meaning animals that are supposed to be sacrificed, they're kochim, and they've been mixed up with korbanot chatat, a chatat, an animal that's supposed to be given a chatat but can't anymore because there's a problem with it, and therefore it cannot be given, right? So an example would be a chatat whose owners died, right? Or with an animal that gored 3 times and is supposed to be killed, right? Those animals are problematic animals in the sense that they are asurim b'hana'ah. They are not permitted for any benefit. So what happens if you have these wonderful animals that are ready to go that you're going to give as korbanot, and an ox that gored gets mixed up among them and you don't know which is which anymore? So the Mishnah says, afilu echad beribo, even if the ratio is 1 to 10,000, meaning there's one bad apple in there, there's one bad ox in there, right? And there are 10,000 ready to go korbanot. If they're mixed up, yamutu kula. They all have to die rather than being given as a korban, right? So this is really intense. How are we supposed to understand this? So of course the Gemara is going to talk about how a behema, how an animal is really significant enough that it's not going to be able to be assimilated within a mixture. You can't cancel it out by any sort of ratio. But the truth is, it's not just full animals. If you look at the Mishnah in Chulin in chapter 7, Mishnah Hay, Gid Hanasha, if you have the sciatic nerve, Shenit Bashel Ima Gidit, and it gets cooked with other nerves or sinews, Bisman Shimakiro, if you can actually identify that sciatic nerve and take it out, then Benotein Tam, then you can do the 60 to 1 ratio and say, as long as it's not giving taste, it's fine. But v'im lav, but if you can't take that gid anash out because you don't know what it is, you can't tell which one it is, kulan asurim. They're all prohibited. Meaning, no bittul, sorry. Nothing we can do about that. And then the Mishnah gives an example, v'chein chaticha shel nevela, even a piece of a nevela, meaning a piece of an animal that died of natural causes or died because it was hunted or died, meaning it didn't get shchita, v'chein chaticha shel dag tamei, or non-kosher fish, a piece of it, shenit bashlu ima chatichot, that was cooked with other pieces, bisman shimakiran benote tam, if you know you can take them out, then fine, it's a matter of taste. If it gives taste, it's a problem, but if it's a ratio where it doesn't give taste, it's not a problem. But v'im lav, but if you can't take it out, because you don't know which one it is, kulan asur, they're all asur, forget about it, right? So, meaning, it seems to be, it's not even just a full animal, it's even parts of the animal, right? There's even this yavish b'yavish situation where there's something that is considered significant enough that it is, not going to, it's not going to be able to be assimilable. We even have an example of Beta Shenolda Biyom Tov, an egg that was born on Yom Tov, right? Now, an egg that was born on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to eat on Yom Tov because it wasn't min hamuchan. It wasn't something that existed before Yom Tov started, meaning it didn't exist out in the world, right? And so the Tosefta in Beta says, Kishem she'asura lochal, kach asura litaltel. Just like it's forbidden to eat, it's also forbidden to be carried on Yontif, meaning it's muktzah, right? And then it goes on and says even more. But what I'm interested in is nitarva b'meya, if it gets mixed up even with 100 eggs that you are allowed to eat. Kulan asura, they're all prohibited. Sorry, no possibility of bittul. So there's something here. There are situations in these yavesh b'yavesh situations. There are situations where you can't, they're not assimilable. You're not going to be able to get the mixture to work. You're not going to be able to nullify. Once we see that, it actually becomes that much more interesting that there are a couple of exceptions to that rule, right? Once you kind of have that as a rule, the exceptions to the rule actually make you wonder, okay, so what were Chazal doing here? What were the rabbis doing here? And the exceptions to the rule you will find in a Mishnah in Masechet Orla, right? Let's just remind ourselves. Orla is the first 3 years of a tree's planting. Its fruits are off limits. In the fourth year, just like Mas or Sheni, kind of, its fruits have to be redeemed with money in order to be eaten. And in the fifth year, they can be eaten. But that's Orla. So in the Mishnah in Orla, the following is described. Truma, Trumat Maser Shel Demai, Chala, Bikurim. These are all examples of agricultural foods that are separated, that are not supposed to be eaten by the non-Kohen. Okay? All of those things, olim be'echad umeya. If they get mixed up, okay? If they get mixed up in things that are for non-Kohanim, as long as there's 101 ratio to the truma or trumat maser. No, trumat maser is what a Levi gives as truma from their own maser. And I don't really want to go into it right now, but it's up to my because it's not clear if maser was given. We're just going to leave it there. Okay. It seems like there is a way to neutralize it. Now, by the way, you also have to take out the amount of truma that you think fell in, um, even within that neutralizing. That comes later in the Mishnah. But what I'm interested in here is that there's something to do about it, right? Again, it's yavish b'yavish. It's dry and dry. But as long as there's, 101 to 1, it's okay. And then it gives another example, not the truma kinds of examples. And yes, I'm including challah, what you give off the portion of your dough to the kohen, and bikurim, the first fruits that you give to the kohen. I'm including those in truma. They're all considered types of like big category. Okay. And there's another big category, agricultural category, ha'orla, v'kilei kerem. What about orla? What about fruits of a tree within its first 3 years? What about kilei hakerem? Now, kilei hakerem are mixtures where you planted a vineyard too close to wheat or other types of things, and that becomes a mixture that's problematic. What if those things fall into something else? Can they be nullified? Also, yavish biyavish, right? It's solid and solid. Olim be'echad u'matayim. There, 201 to 1 is fine, right? Also, that also has a way to be fixed. And there, by the way, you don't have to take out the amount of orla that you think fell in. You don't have to take out the amount of kila. Huh. Why did these two buck the rule? Right? Now, I had to get you here, right? Because many of us, when we hear, oh, mixtures, taruva, we say to ourselves, oh, 60 to 1 or majority or no, 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 no. The rule that we just looked at in Sifrut Tanait Talmudic literature is looking at a situation of yavish beyavish, dry and dry, seeing that there seems to be no way around it, like tough noogies, as we say in our house. And now we see exceptions to that rule. And the exceptions to that rule seem to be truma, writ large, agricultural, and plantings, right? Orla, kilea karim, writ large. So why are these the yotzim min haklal? Why are they the exceptions? And now here's where the philosophy comes in, or the legal philosophy comes in. There's three different answers that I want to offer today from three different academic sources, right? When I say academic, I mean you're not going to find it, in a Rishon or in an Achron. You're going to find it in somebody who's writing from an academic perspective. The first is by someone named Zuckermandel. If you ever look at the printing, different types of printings of Tosefta, you will sometimes see the Zuckermandel Tosefta. Okay. Now, the Zuckermandel, he is a person, right? He's a person. And he basically suggests that I think there's a difference between something that is a, I don't know, something that is a gidanasha, for example, and something that is truma. In what sense? He says a gidanasha, you didn't give it its inherent quality of off limits. It's naturally that way, and thus it is unassimilable. But truma, what made something truma is that you separated it as a truma, as truma. Therefore, the rabbis figured out a way that it could be assimilated in a mixture. And I like this answer because I do think it forces us to think about, when we say something is usser, when we say something is off limits, what made it off limits, right? And there are certain things that are off limits because they are naturally off limits, like Gitanasha. There are other things that are off limits because we've made them off limits because of something we've said, something we've designated. And it's just interesting to think about halakhically in general. That's one answer. Another answer comes from Leib Moskowitz. He's an academic who's alive today. And Moskowitz, he suggests, actually, I think what might be going on here is we might be looking at specifically agricultural rules, right? That many of the rabbis did not think applied biblically anymore. And so because they apply rabbinically and not biblically, the rabbis were willing to be more lenient and figure out a way for there to be mixtures. Or meaning figure out a way to work with the mixtures. Now that also I find very interesting. The question of what can you actually work with and what can't you work with? If something is a biblical prohibition, it may be more unassimilable than something that's a rabbinic prohibition, right? That's the second. The third comes from Ethan Tucker in his dissertation, which is all about mixtures. And he quotes Zuckermandel and Moskowitz, and he has his own take, which is he says, well, maybe it's just harder to keep these things separate. Think about it. If you're harvesting in the field, I mean, you're harvesting and stuff gets mixed up once it's cut from the ground. But if you're dealing with korbanot and you're dealing with an ox that gored, shouldn't it be easy to keep those two things separate? Right? If you're dealing with a Beitza, an egg that was just hatched, and eggs that were hatched yesterday, shouldn't it be easy to keep them separate? And so the question is, maybe it's a little bit more difficult. And given the other reasons, given the idea that Chazal are able to set the laws of mixtures, Is it possible that in situations where you're not really going to be able to avoid the mix-up, you have to be able to find some way out of it? Whereas in situations where you could have avoided the mix-up, you may not have that issue. I like this as well, because if Chazal are really empowered to make those decisions, there is a not just scholastic way of looking at things, there's a realistic way of looking at things and saying, ooh, this is going to cost too much. It's going to cost too much. Could you imagine if you have to invalidate every mixture that you end up with in the field? So, what I really want to say is that buried in that first little line in the Mishnah in the eighth perek is so much legal philosophy. Question of being scholastics, questions of dealing with human fallibility, questions of dealing with the difference between something that is prohibited naturally versus based on human action, questions of do we think something is an Isser D'Oraita, a biblical prohibition, or a rabbinic prohibition, and what is the likelihood of the fallibility occurring here. So all in that first line. Enjoy that eighth perek, knowing how much is there in the layers. Thanks for learning with me, as always.